You have nowhere to go." Lillian said it like she was stating a fact, not delivering a verdict. We were standing in the kitchen of the house she'd bought before we met, the overhead light still on even though morning sun was coming through the window behind her. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, already finished with the conversation before I'd had a chance to process what she'd told me. She'd been seeing her ex-boyfriend for 8 months. 8 months of business trips that I'd helped her pack for, of late-night calls I assumed were work emergencies, of weekend conferences I never questioned. She wanted me out by the weekend. When I asked about the furniture I'd bought or the kitchen renovation I'd paid for, she tilted her head slightly and said I should have thought about protection if I wanted it. My name was on the utility bills. Hers was on the deed. I had no claim because I'd never insisted on one. The room went quiet in a way that made my chest feel tight. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to reconsider or tell me why. I just stood there, recognizing something I should have seen months ago. She'd been deciding things without me for years and explaining them after. I'd told myself that was compromise. That was maturity. That was what made us work. I was wrong. I moved out 3 days later. I took my clothes, my laptop, and a box of personal documents I'd kept in the closet. Everything else stayed. The couch I'd bought when we moved in together. The dining table I'd assembled. The patio furniture I'd picked out. I didn't ask for any of it back. I didn't want to give her a reason to make this harder than it already was. I called a former college roommate in Cincinnati who said I could stay in his spare room until I figured things out. I loaded my car in 2 trips while Lillian was at work. I didn't leave a note. I'd already said everything I needed to say, which was nothing. I worked as a logistics coordinator for a mid-sized freight company in Columbus. My job was to track shipments, flag delays before they became problems, and notice patterns in data that other people missed. I was good at it because I paid attention to details that seemed small until they weren't. At home, I'd ignored every detail that mattered. Lillian traveled constantly for work. She was a senior HR consultant who earned nearly twice what I did. When I'd suggested opening a joint account or adding my name to the mortgage, she'd reframed it as a trust issue. I'd back down every time. Now I understood why. 2 months passed. I found a small apartment in Columbus and signed a lease in my own name. I went to work, came home, and tried not to think about how much of my life I'd spent accommodating someone who had been planning an exit the entire time. I didn't contact Lillian. She didn't contact me. It felt like proof that everything between us had been exactly as one-sided as I'd suspected. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID showed a law firm I didn't recognize. I answered expecting a spam call, but the woman on the other end introduced herself as an attorney representing Lillian's employer. She said they were conducting a routine internal review and needed to verify some dates. Specifically, she wanted to confirm when I'd lived at Lillian's address. I pulled up my personal records out of habit. I'd kept a folder with lease documents, utility bills, and receipts from the time we'd lived together. I gave her the dates. She thanked me and asked if I'd be willing to provide written confirmation if needed. I said yes. She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to understand what kind of internal review would require verifying where someone's ex-partner had lived. It didn't make sense. But I'd answered honestly, and that was all I could do. A week later, I got a message on LinkedIn from someone I didn't know. Her name was Monica Harriman, and her profile said she'd worked in compliance at the same firm where Lillian was a consultant. The message was short and carefully worded. She said she'd been terminated recently and was gathering information for a potential retaliation claim. She asked if I'd be willing to answer a few questions about Lillian. I didn't respond right away. I thought about ignoring it entirely. But something about the timing felt deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was holding. I messaged her back and said I'd answer what I could. She called me that evening. She didn't waste time with small talk. She asked if I knew Lillian had been in a relationship with a subordinate at her firm. I said I didn't. She asked if I knew the subordinate's name. I said no. Then she said his name, and I recognized it immediately. It was the ex-boyfriend. The one Lillian had been seeing for 8 months. Monica sent me a timeline after we hung up. Dates, performance reviews, promotions, travel authorizations. I read through it twice, and that's when I started noticing things I already had. I'd kept some of Lillian's receipts during the time we lived together. Not intentionally, but because we'd shared a filing system, and I'd been the one who organized it. Toll statements from her company card. Fuel receipts she'd submitted for reimbursement. I pulled them out and compared them to the timeline Monica had sent me. The trips Lillian said were taking her to client sites in Detroit and Pittsburgh had toll records showing she'd never left the Columbus metro area. Fuel purchases dated on days she claimed to be 2 states away were logged at gas stations 15 minutes from her office. She'd filed all of it as corporate travel. I didn't feel angry when I saw it. I felt something colder. In logistics, paper trails don't accuse anyone. They just sit there, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I waited a day before I did anything. Then I forwarded the attorney's contact information to Monica, without adding commentary. I didn't follow up. I didn't need to. For a while, nothing happened. I went to work. I came home. I started seeing a therapist my insurance covered because I needed help understanding how I'd spent 3 years ignoring things that should have been obvious. The therapist asked me questions I didn't have answers for. Why had I accepted financial arrangements that left me vulnerable? Why had I never pushed back when Lillian made unilateral decisions? I didn't know. I'd wanted things to work, and I'd believed that meant not causing problems. The therapist told me that wasn't compromise. It was self-erasure. I wrote that phrase down because it felt true in a way that made my chest hurt. 3 months after I'd forwarded the attorney's information, I ran into someone I knew from a networking event Lillian had brought me to a year earlier. We were in line at a coffee shop, and he recognized me first. He asked how I was doing, and I gave the standard answer, fine, busy. He nodded, then hesitated before saying he'd heard Lillian had left her firm. I didn't ask for details. He offered them anyway. Something about an investigation, professional complications. He wasn't clear on the specifics, and I didn't press. I thanked him and left the coffee shop. I sat in my car for a few minutes. The steering wheel was warm from the sun. I thought about calling Monica to see how her case had gone, but I didn't know what I'd say. I'd given her what I could, and after that, it wasn't mine to follow. I started the engine and drove home. I didn't think about Lillian much after that. When I did, it felt distant, like remembering a job I'd left years ago rather than a person I'd almost married. I heard things occasionally through mutual acquaintances. She wasn't consulting anymore. There'd been some kind of review. No one seemed to know the full story, and I didn't ask. What I felt wasn't relief or vindication. It was closer to recognition. Lillian had built a career on advising companies about ethics and compliance. The pattern had been there the whole time. Someone just had to notice it. I thought about the toll records, the fuel receipts, the dates that didn't line up. I thought about how I'd organized them without knowing why they mattered. In my line of work, you learn that the details you track today might only make sense months later. You learn that systems reveal themselves slowly, and that the truth is usually hiding in plain sight. I made dinner that night and let the rest go. The apartment I'd rented was small, but it was mine. The lease had my name on it. The security deposit had come from my account. When I hung pictures on the walls, I didn't ask anyone's permission. When I bought a new couch, I picked the one I wanted, without running it past someone who'd tell me it didn't fit the aesthetic she'd already decided on. I started documenting things differently at work too. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd learned that clarity mattered more than I'd realized. I kept records of conversations. I confirmed decisions in writing. When something felt off, I asked questions instead of assuming I was misunderstanding. My manager noticed and mentioned it during a review. She said I seemed more confident, more present. I told her I was working on it. That was true. I was working on believing that my perspective mattered, that my instincts were worth trusting, that saying no to something wasn't the same as causing a problem. The therapist had helped me see that the way I'd operated in my relationship with Lillian had bled into other parts of my life. I'd been so focused on not making waves that I'd stopped noticing when I was drowning. 6 months after everything fell apart, I was offered a promotion to senior logistics analyst. It came with a raise and a different team. I accepted it without hesitating, which felt like progress. The old version of me would have second-guessed whether I deserved it or worried that someone else might have wanted it more. I moved into a slightly bigger apartment in a neighborhood I actually liked. I started running in the mornings because it gave me time to think without distraction. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the years I'd spent trying to make Lillian happy. They didn't ask many questions about what had happened. They just said they were glad I was doing better. I was doing better. Not because Lillian's career had imploded or because I'd found some kind of closure in watching her face consequences. I was doing better because I'd stopped waiting for someone else to tell me what my life should look like. I'd stopped trading clarity for calm. I'd stopped believing that keeping the peace meant giving up pieces of myself until there was nothing left to negotiate with. I still saw the therapist once a month. We talked less about Lillian now and more about patterns I wanted to break. I never spoke to Lillian again. I didn't block her number, but she never called. I didn't seek out information about what happened to her after she left her firm, and no one volunteered it. That chapter of my life had closed in the quietest possible way, and I preferred it that way. What stayed with me wasn't the betrayal or the affair or even the casual cruelty of being told I had nowhere to go. What stayed with me was the realization that I'd had somewhere to go the entire time. I just hadn't believed it. I'd spent years thinking that stability meant staying, that maturity meant not making demands, that love meant accommodating someone else's certainty at the expense of my own. I was wrong about all of it. Stability isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about building something solid enough to withstand it. Maturity isn't about keeping quiet. It's about knowing when to speak and having the courage to do it. And love, real love, doesn't ask you to shrink. I used to think having nowhere to go meant failure. I understand now that it was the moment I stopped standing still. It was the moment I started moving toward something I'd built myself, in my own name, on my own terms.